so deciding instead to study dentistry. He spent 6 years at Queen's University, and during that time he would keep himself to himself. He wasn't very sociable and just wanted to get through and get the qualifications he needed. Then, one morning while Colin had been at a church event at the University Halls of Residence, he saw a young Leslie Clark sat across the other side of the room. The writer of the book, Let This Be Our Secret, Derek Henderson, which I've linked in the show notes and is sourced throughout today's episode, describes Leslie as having a, quote, gentle voice, warm smile, shiny dark hair and sparkling eyes. Leslie was born in Plymouth in England, where her dad Harry had been based whilst in the Marines. She had an older brother Chris, who she got on well with, and her mum May, who she was also close to. The family had moved around a lot in Leslie's earliest years, but she spent the majority of her childhood years growing up in a tight-knit community in Dublin, and many of the friends she gained through her childhood stayed with her through her teen years and into adulthood. She became close with a young girl called Valerie, who would become one of her very best and closest friends for the rest of her life. The two of them joined a youth club and would spend almost every weekend together. It wasn't unusual for Leslie and Valerie to end their evenings in the local pubs. They weren't quite of drinking age yet, but it didn't matter. They would dress up and act the part, and more often than not, got served a pint of Guinness or a baby sham before returning home. Leslie had gone on to study to be a nurse, like her auntie and two of her cousins, at Belfast's Royal Victoria Hospital, where she lived with a few of her peers who became her friends. She enjoyed her time there and spent it as most young students do, exploring the city, making new friends, and dating. She'd been on dates with a few different men and had actually met someone she quite liked. A junior doctor who was Catholic and from Belfast. The two began casually dating over the next few weeks. And then, one day she was invited along to a church gathering at another Halls of Residence, and it was there she first met Colin. The two hit it off and ended up getting on really well. Colin became infatuated with Leslie pretty early on, and although Leslie was interested in him, she was still set on the junior doctor from Belfast. She was still studying and wasn't necessarily looking for anything too serious at this point. But Colin wouldn't stand for that, and one night, after Leslie had been out with the junior doctor, she returned home to find Colin waiting for her. He told Leslie how he felt about her and ended up in some kind of physical altercation with the other man, who did end up leaving Leslie's house soon after. And with that, Colin decided that he wanted to be with Leslie, and that was that. It wasn't long before Colin and Leslie were in a serious relationship. Colin invited Leslie along to the dentist's formal at Queen's University. Leslie went dress shopping for the special occasion and bought an expensive gown to wear. She looked beautiful. The next few weeks progressed into months, and it wasn't long before the couple had gone on holiday together to Greece, where Leslie finally began to feel a connection similar to what Colin had been feeling for the last year or so. In August of 1982, Leslie wrote to her best friend Valerie to tell her just how happy she was with Colin. It was a relief. They'd been dating for a while now, and she had been worried that she hadn't felt connected to him properly up until this point. But their holiday to Greece changed things. She'd begun to feel strongly for him. She wasn't interested in anyone else and was connecting with him on a level she compared to family. By the time 1983 came around, Colin had proposed to Leslie and she'd accepted. The two were engaged and planned the wedding relatively quickly. Colin only had a few final exams to sit before he was fully qualified dentist, and after he'd sat and passed those, the two got married. Everything had gone to plan from an outside eye. The two had met, fallen in love, gotten engaged, and then married. And it wouldn't be long before they upped and relocated to Coleraine, where Colin had gained his first dentistry job. But on the inside, both Colin and Leslie were unsure about marrying each other. Ultimately, they were convinced by the fact they'd spent a fair amount of time together, and Colin was worried no one else would want him after all he and Leslie had been through. At the time of the engagement and then marriage, no one knew what that really meant, and it wouldn't be revealed until many years later. Even though Colin had been vocal and firm in his belief that sex before marriage was a big no-no, he hadn't actually practiced that in his relationship with Leslie. The pair had slept together a number of times before their marriage, and as a result of the unplanned and, in Colin's eyes, sinful acts, Leslie had actually become pregnant a total of 3 times before their wedding. He couldn't have been seen to have committed such a sin as sex before marriage, so instead decided to commit a, quote, sin that he knew he could get away with. No one needed to know about the abortions except for him and Leslie. Leslie had initially been reluctant to have the abortions, but she told a friend of hers each time that she worried if she didn't terminate the pregnancy, Colin would leave her. She paid the money needed for transportation and other costs that came with travelling from Belfast to a clinic in West London. Just under 15 years earlier, the UK had passed the 1967 Abortion Act, which made terminations legal in Great Britain, up to 24 weeks in most cases. But this Abortion Act didn't include Northern Ireland, which meant that Leslie and Colin had no choice but to travel almost 500 miles from Belfast to London. And then, on the 15th of July 1983, Leslie and her bridesmaids got set up for the evening in the Conway Hotel near Dunmurry in Belfast. The next morning was sunny and warm, and the couple got married at the Windsor Baptist Church. One side of the room housed tables for guests who decided they would drink, and the other side for those who, owing to their strict religious practices, which mainly consisted of Colin's mother Sarah and her side of guests, had no alcohol. The room and the families were quite separated in their view of religious practices. Although both sides of the family were religious, Leslie's father Harry saw no harm in having the guests enjoy a drink or two whilst the celebrations were happening after the ceremony itself. Colin's mother Sarah, however, was Baptist and practiced in a much stricter way. Colin took pride in having a similar level of strictness in his practices and was firm in his desire to not have sex before marriage, and once he and Leslie were married, he would love her until death do they part. Once the pair had moved to Coleraine, they first rented and then bought a house so that they could permanently set up their lives together. And although things had started out well, because of the nature of moving somewhere new, setting up a new life and meeting lots of people, things quickly regressed for Leslie. She found life in Coleraine difficult. She'd loved living in Belfast and asked Colin if they could think about moving back. But Colin wasn't up for that at all. His career in dentistry came first, and he was doing well in Coleraine, so they'd be staying. Not long after they got married, Leslie became pregnant, and in August of 1984, she gave birth to her and Colin's first child, Matthew. And with that, Leslie stopped working and became a stay-at-home mum, something she was pretty happy about at the time. She hadn't been enjoying her new job in Coleraine Hospital and was grateful for the switch to staying home with Matthew. Even with Colin's long working hours and Leslie being a full-time stay-at-home mum, the couple continued to be active members of the church. They joined the local Baptist church and not only gained a number of friends through the church, but also spent a lot of time with the church elders. Leslie, meanwhile, was struggling with life as a stay-at-home mum, being in a new city, not knowing anyone, not having any family nearby, and not having a job to go to. She liked her independence, and this lifestyle didn't give her chance to have her own life. In 1986, though, things were about to shift again when Leslie's mum became extremely unwell. She suffered with heart problems and eventually was taken into a nursing home where her condition worsened and she passed away just a few weeks later. Just over 2 months later, whilst dealing with the grief of losing her mum, Leslie gave birth to her and Colin's second child, Lauren. The distraction of having another child to look after was welcome at first, but quickly progressed into a form of postnatal depression, during which time Colin was not around. His career had continued upwards, and by this point, 5 years into his time working in Coleraine, he thought he knew best and could help to improve the dental practice he was working at. Colin's bosses didn't necessarily think his ideas and propositions were the best for the business and didn't respond in the way he hoped. Colin wasn't happy about this. He believed he knew best, and so he decided to invest €34,000 into a property a little under 10 miles away in Ballymoney, where he'd eventually open up his own practice. He hadn't thought to discuss this with Leslie, and she wasn't best pleased about this big investment and potential risk. She was now pregnant again, this time with their third child, and before long, Daniel was born and the family of 5 moved into a larger house on the other side of town. Their new home, along with the huge investment put into the dental practice, put a strain on their finances, and the family were living at the extent of their overdraft. By 1989, Leslie fell pregnant again with their 4th child. Although this was exciting news for the couple, it was overshadowed by the discovery of an affair that Colin had previously had. Back when Leslie was pregnant with the couple's 3rd child, Daniel, Colin had a short-term affair with someone he'd met back at university. She was also married at the time, but the two of them had an affair for around a month. That shattered any sense of trust that Leslie and Colin had in their marriage, and although it had ended before Leslie had found out about it, she never fully trusted him again. The couple did consider divorce at one point, but owing to their strict religious beliefs, Colin insisted it wasn't an option. Life continued for the couple, and Leslie tried as hard as she could to get back to normal. She wanted to trust Colin. She was married to him after all, and they had children to think about. Leslie immersed herself as much as she could into motherhood and raising 4 children. Coleraine was a big town, but it seemed everyone knew everyone, and putting on a strong, united front was important to Leslie, and more so, Colin. By this point, the couple's 2nd child, Lauren, was attending Mulberry Bush Nursery School, where she was looked after by nursery assistant Hazel Buchanan. Hazel was born in 1963 and spent her early years living on a dairy farm. She was one of 10 children. She had 5 sisters and 4 brothers, and the entire family were devoted Baptists who would regularly attend church. She grew up in a fairly strict home environment. All the children were expected to help out on the farm, and Hazel didn't love it. She wasn't the outdoorsy type and would prefer to stay inside helping her mum with housekeeping chores. By the time Hazel was 16, she had started dating her first proper boyfriend, Mervyn McLaughlin. She was excited to have someone she could grow with and see the world with, but tragedy struck sometime after they had started dating. Mervyn was riding his motorbike on his way to a small village just a few minutes away when he crashed and was immediately killed. Hazel was devastated and asked to keep a part of his motorbike as a way to remember him. It wasn't too long after that Hazel began working at a local grocery store. She was working there one afternoon when 20-year-old Trevor Buchanan walked in. He was walking for the Royal Ulster Constabulary at the time, and he would often come into the shop with his colleagues to buy supplies for their shifts ahead. Trevor had always been set on working as a police officer. His 2 older brothers had done the same, and he wanted to follow in their footsteps. He knew, though, that he was at real risk of not being accepted into the force because of his height. Back in the 1970s, you had to be at least 5 foot 8 inches tall if you wanted to be accepted into the Royal Ulster Constabulary. With this at the forefront of his mind, one morning he lugged the mattress from his bed out of his room and down to the front door. He replaced where his mattress once was with wooden boards. He'd convinced himself that this would help his posture straighten out and he'd be tall enough to join. He also spent hours hanging by his feet over the door in hopes that he'd grow a couple of millimetres. Whether or not any of that helped is hard to say, but either way, Trevor was accepted into the Royal Ulster Constabulary just meeting the required 5'8" height. It wasn't long before Trevor introduced his first serious girlfriend to the rest of his family, and Hazel came across well. She was kind and friendly and got on with everyone. Trevor's sister Melva particularly took a shine to Hazel and gave Trevor her approval and excitement to see how the relationship would progress. The couple continued dating, and by 1981 they were engaged and then married. Trevor's sister Melva was thrilled when she was asked, along with two of Hazel's sisters, to be bridesmaids on the big day. It was clear to all the 100 guests that day that Trevor was smitten. He was beaming the whole day. He couldn't believe his luck. He'd married the woman of his dreams, and it wasn't long before the couple were ready to properly settle down and start a family of their own. They bought a house in the local town, and not long after that, Hazel gave birth to the couple's first child, Lisa. Then Hazel became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a baby boy they named Andrew. Trevor took fatherhood in his stride. He loved nothing more than taking the children to a park or to church. Hazel had influenced Trevor to join their local church, and it wasn't long before he had fully immersed himself in the religious life that his wife had led for the entirety of her life so far. The couple brought the children up in a Baptist home and would attend church every Sunday morning, afternoon, and night without fail. Trevor was constantly on the lookout for better ways to provide for his growing family and ended up going for and being offered a job as a scenes of crime officer. This job suited him perfectly. He found that he thrived in situations that required minute detail, something essential for this kind of job. His pride for his work seeped into all areas of his life, and the family home he and Hazel owned was always in pristine condition, thanks to both of them working tirelessly to make sure it always looked its best. Trevor's family and friends were astonished at how well they managed to keep the house, whilst also raising two young children, and it soon became clear that Trevor was completely at the will of Hazel. She was a loving wife and incredibly caring mother, but above all, she cared about appearance. That not only meant that the house had to be sparkling at all times, but it also meant that if she felt she needed Trevor, he had to be there for her, no matter what. Some of Trevor's friends did notice that he wasn't able to see them as much, and even when his best friend John had gone through an emotionally turbulent time in his life, Trevor was made to leave John's house and come back home. John told Trevor he needed him, and Trevor wanted to be there for him, but he needed to go home to Hazel. It wasn't long before Trevor's closest friendships had all taken a back seat, and his admiration for his wife took over any other kind of relationship, family and friends. Hazel, Trevor and their two children then moved 60 miles north to Coleraine. Unfortunately, once in Coleraine, Trevor and Hazel's relationship began to break down. In reality, Trevor wasn't entirely aware of this at the time. He was working long hours, clocking up overtime so he could support the family and taking on night shifts so that he could also clock up on good credit. He loved his job and he had a huge amount of pride in the work he did, so he was keen to continue progressing. Meanwhile, Hazel began to immerse the family into living life in Coleraine. The busy high street was home to a number of well-established shops that Hazel would take the children to buy new shoes and bags ahead of the start of the academic year. She also registered the family at the local dentist, which is where she first met Colin Howell. She had her usual checkup, as did the children, and then they left. Hazel had recently started working as a nursery assistant at the local Mulberry Bush nursery, where Colin and Leslie had brought Lauren to attend. More often than not, Leslie would be the one to drop off or pick up Lauren from nursery. But there had been a number of times when Colin came to do the daily pickup. On those occasions, he and Hazel would wave and say a quick hello. And then one time, Colin made his way towards Hazel and started up a bit more of a conversation with her. The two chatted, and by the time they looked up, the rest of the playground had emptied, and Hazel said she better get back inside to clean up. It wasn't long before the pair met again, this time at Ryder Leisure Centre. Colin had taken the children to swimming lessons, and as he arrived at the pool, he saw a number of other parents waiting with their children to go into the changing rooms. Towards the front of the group, he saw Hazel with her children making her way into the changing rooms. Once everyone was in the pool, Hazel noticed Colin and said hello. She also mentioned that she was looking to improve her breathing practice whilst doing the front crawl, something Colin said he could help her with. She agreed, and over the next few weeks, the children's swimming lessons doubled up as Colin teaching Hazel too. With each week that passed, more time was spent with just Colin and Hazel, and it wasn't long before the flirting began. Colin took the laughter and time spent together as a sign. One day, he decided to take things a step further. As he was showing her a swimming move in the pool, he held onto her waist and slowly moved his hand down her stomach and towards her thighs. He then said, quote, "If I'm having wrong thoughts about you, you'll have to forgive me." To which Hazel replied, quote, "I'm not so innocent myself." From there onwards, things progressed quickly. Less than a few weeks later, the church's Children's Special Services mission organised a group outing to the nearby beach at Castle Rock. A number of families went along, and afterwards, Colin and Hazel headed back to Colin's house to wash the sand off of the children's hands and feet. As they were doing this, Hazel leant over to Colin and rubbed his arm, saying she was helping him to get the sand off. But just a few moments later, the two of them made their way out of the bathroom and into Colin's bedroom. Without the children in the same room as them, things quickly progressed to the pair sharing their first kiss. They knew now that they had crossed a line. Anything that before could have been fobbed off as some kind of faraway fantasy had become a reality. The pair decided they needed an excuse to see each other alone. So Hazel asked Colin if he could teach her some new chords on the guitar. Colin played in the church group and everyone knew he was good at guitar, so that seemed like the perfect excuse. By the summer of 1990, Colin and Hazel were involved in a full-blown affair. Whilst Trevor was out, the pair slept together for the first time. They continued seeing each other, often meeting at Hazel's house or Colin's dental practice, or escaping to nearby towns where they could hold hands and play couples without worrying about any of their fellow churchgoers or neighbours seeing them. It wasn't long after the first time they slept together that Hazel began to feel unwell. She wasn't sure what the cause was at first, but then she realised she was late on her period. She was pregnant. She knew it could be Colin's baby. Their strict religion, that they were both so attached to, told them that abortion was a sin, but it also said that adultery and lying were sins, so Colin didn't hesitate when he booked flights over to London where the pair would visit an abortion clinic. The same abortion clinic he'd taken Leslie to years earlier. After the abortion, Hazel and Colin returned to Belfast. They'd made their separate excuses, and their partners, Leslie and Trevor, had no choice but to let them go. Hazel had left Trevor a note early on the morning she headed to Belfast Airport, simply saying she was going through a tough time and needed a few days alone. In the note, she said not to worry and that she'd be back soon. By this point, both Trevor and Leslie had their suspicions. One afternoon, Leslie invited her friend round for coffee. She told her that she was confused. She'd been washing Colin's tracksuit that he ran in most evenings when she'd found a load of 20-pence pieces. She asked her friend what on earth he'd need those for whilst out jogging. In reality, Colin made sure to always have a number of coins on him so that he could use the payphone to call Hazel. Back at home, they were secretive but bold in their communication. This was before the times of regular people owning and using mobile phones, so Colin would call Hazel's house phone. Usually Trevor was in, Often it was late at night, so he'd be sleeping. Colin would make sure to hang up just before the ringtone, so Hazel and Trevor's house phone would only sound out a simple click. That click was the sign Hazel took as Colin wanting to talk. She'd escape into the kitchen, pull the corded phone around the corner and dial his number. They would speak for hours, but it wasn't an easy feat. In order to stop the late-night telephone calls appearing on their phone bills, they'd have to call off after 9 minutes and then ring back. But they did so for hours at a time. Leslie knew something was up, and her suspicions were confirmed when she heard Colin on the other side of the wall in the kitchen speaking in whispers to someone on the phone. Leslie decided to confide in the pastor, who confronted Colin and Hazel separately. Being faced with the authority of the church in front of her, Hazel admitted to the affair, but did assure the pastor that she and Colin had never had sex. The pastor then made his way to see Leslie to inform her, and together they confronted Colin. After that, both Hazel and Colin were stripped of certain church duties and were ordered to attend couples counselling with their partners. Trevor was devastated by Hazel's infidelity. He adored her and was deeply hurt that she had not only lied to him, but also was able to keep doing so for the number of months the affair had been going on for. He still loved his wife and was determined to start afresh with Hazel. Leslie, on the other hand, found it almost impossible to start afresh. She couldn't help but see Colin's betrayal every time they were together. It wasn't long before she learnt the full extent of her husband's affair. She was informed that he and Hazel had actually slept together. This was too much for Leslie to handle. She became depressed and developed a dependency on alcohol. The doctor prescribed her antidepressants, and she would spend her evenings alone drinking a bottle of red wine. One afternoon, after the revelation of Colin and Hazel having slept together, Leslie became furious. She pushed at Colin, she hit him, and then she ran into the bathroom to get away from him. She was utterly distraught, and her anger quickly melted into devastation. She didn't know how she could go on now she had this new information. This was a betrayal to a whole nother level. Leslie opened the door to the bathroom cabinet. She took out a bottle of painkillers. Through tears, she stared down at the bottle and then pulled the lid off. She lifted the bottle up to her mouth and poured them down her throat. After that, she stormed out of the bathroom, past Colin, out of the front door and into her car. Colin called the pastor for his help, and he did manage to find Leslie and take her to the A&E ward at the local hospital. She ended up staying there for a total of 3 days, and social services were informed because the overdose was considered to be an attempt to take her own life. Leslie assured them that the overdose had been a momentary judgment lapse. She would never leave her children. That's what made her return. That's what made her get medical help. She couldn't leave her children. By spring of 1991, Leslie and Colin's home life had seemingly settled down. From the outside, it looked as though the pair were working together, trying to get through a very difficult point in their marriage. But behind closed doors, the couple were still having an incredibly challenging time. One evening in April of 1991, Leslie had decided to treat herself to a nice, relaxing bath. She loved to listen to music, but knew the cord of the tape recorder wouldn't reach all the way to the bath. She plugged in an extension cable and then ran the tape recorder up to just behind her in the bathroom. After she'd been in the bath for a little while, Colin came in and said he wanted to use the tape recorder. He lifted it up, and as he did so, the cable came out and somehow landed on Leslie's arm in the bath. This was attached to the main electricity supply and meant that as it touched her arm and the water, it gave her an electric shock. Thankfully, the cord had then fallen straight onto the floor, so she was able to get up and out to safety. She didn't really know how the cord had ended up in the bath, and afterwards, Colin asked her not to tell anyone. to promise that she wouldn't say anything. Leslie thought it was odd that he'd made her promise not to tell anyone, so she called 3 of her friends over the next couple of days, saying, quote, "I'm telling you this in case anything happens to me." Just under a month later, Leslie and Colin went to see a show at the theatre. They agreed it'd be good to get out of the house, and Leslie did love going to the theatre. When they returned home, however, tragedy struck. Leslie's dad, Harry, had come round to her and Colin's house whilst they were out. He'd sat down at the kitchen table and he'd suddenly felt a pain. He was suffering from a suspected heart attack. He collapsed and died pretty much straight away. Her dad's death sent Leslie into an even deeper depression. With the loss of him, she didn't know how she would cope. She already felt as though she was at rock bottom, but this pushed her even further. Her friends who were trying to support her during that time all spoke of her struggle. Quote, "The bubbly personality had gone. She was sad and angry, emotional and struggling to keep herself and the family together. I knew it was a huge effort for her to keep going. She told me she wasn't sleeping right. I could tell she was stressed." End quote. She also began drinking even more heavily. She didn't want to think about Colin and their marriage. One afternoon, things had gotten so bad that when Colin came into the kitchen, he found Leslie on the floor next to a pile of vomit and red wine all over the place. One of the young children was standing next to her holding a broken glass bottle in some attempt to try and help the situation. When the pastor returned from a trip away, he heard of Leslie's dad's death and knew how devastated she would be. He went straight to her house to visit her and offer his condolences. When he arrived, it was mid-morning, but Leslie wasn't dressed. She came to the door in her dressing gown, and when they sat down in the living room, she poured herself 2 cups of coffee. It was very clear that she was in the midst of grief. After their chat, Leslie seemed different. She pulled the pastor close in a hug and thanked him for all the help he'd given her. She kept him held in that hug and said her goodbyes. The Sunday after her dad's funeral, the 12th of May 1991, Leslie had been drinking all day. She couldn't stop crying and she felt utterly hopeless. That evening, as she and Colin got into bed, they both spent the next hour tossing and turning. Neither could sleep, and Leslie was still furious. She turned to Colin and told him, quote, "This is going to be over soon. I am going to go to heaven. Maybe you and Hazel are meant to be together. I'll never get over this. Trevor will never get over this." End quote. The next few days passed as normal, Leslie trying hard to maintain the family house whilst also dealing with her immense grief from her dad's passing. During that time, she and Colin had yet another huge argument, during which Leslie had shouted, quote, "You'd probably be better off if Trevor and I were killed in a car crash." End quote. On Saturday, the 18th of May 1991, Leslie and Colin threw a birthday party for their son, Daniel, who had turned 2. Colin spent some time in the garage putting together one of Daniel's birthday presents, a colourful plastic slide. He spent a little longer in the garage, picking up an old empty baby's feeding bottle before heading out to check on the rest of the party. Leslie had a few things to do that afternoon. She realised that she hadn't got Daniel a card, so went into the town centre to buy one, along with running a couple of other errands. While she was out, she found her way into the local couples cafe for a coffee, where she ran into her next-door neighbour, Rosemary. Rosemary told Leslie how sorry she was about her father's death, and she noticed that Leslie was, quote, "just mechanically going through the motions of doing general domestic things, but had no real interest in what she was doing," end quote. The afternoon and evening were full of children playing and eating cake, and by the usual 8 p.m. bedtime, no one was ready for bed. Colin let the children stay up a little while longer while Leslie headed out to her sunbed appointment. She also visited the local garage to fill her car up with petrol. The petrol owner's wife, Gillian, had become concerned when she noticed that Leslie was wobbly on her feet and had taken a good few tries to properly insert the petrol nozzle into the car. Gillian had been so worried that she'd actually called Colin and told him she was concerned about Leslie. When Leslie returned home, she disappeared off to the living room. She bought a 3-litre box of red wine earlier in the day and just wanted to sit in front of the fire in her pyjamas and drink on her own. By 10 p.m. that night, Colin told the children it really was time for bed now. He put them to sleep and then heard Leslie talking to someone. He quickly realised who it was: Trevor Buchanan. Colin marched into the living room to confront the pair, but there was little use. Trevor and Leslie were angry and had every right to be. When Trevor saw Colin, he spoke directly about his relationship with Hazel, and that verbal altercation quickly turned physical. Trevor stepped towards Colin as if to grab him, but Colin managed to grab a hold of Trevor and restrain him. Colin said that seemed to shock Trevor back into reality, and he immediately apologised. Leslie wasn't having that though, and told Colin to leave immediately so that she and Trevor could talk alone. After 10 minutes, Colin heard Trevor leave and so made his way into the living room to try and reconcile with Leslie. The time was just after 11:30 p.m, and Leslie didn't want to talk. She told Colin to go away and that she wanted to be alone. With that, Colin went to check in on the children, and seeing that they were safely sleeping in bed, he made his own way to bed just after midnight. He knew that Leslie would probably sleep in the living room on the sofa, as had become the norm since the affair. The next morning, Colin woke up around 8:20 a.m. He was confused when he didn't find Leslie next to him in bed or in the living room. The children hadn't been tended to. The garage door was open and his car was missing. No matter the kind of argument they'd had, Colin knew it was very odd that Leslie hadn't come home or called to check in. And Colin said what was even more bizarre was what he found on the kitchen table. It was a number of pieces of paper with Leslie's handwriting on. The handwritten letter said, quote, "Dear Colin, I'm just trying to go to sleep now. For how long, I don't know. Thank you for your help over the past few days and for the good times in our marriage. I don't know what to say to you because I don't know how I feel, but I have seen that life goes on after a few weeks of pain, and let's face it, Colin, I am nothing in comparison to what you lost in the one you loved a while back. If I wake up in the morning, just let this be our secret. Leslie." End quote. It also had the date of her dad's death on it. She had then written the details of his funeral but had written 1 p.m. rather than the actual time of 11 a.m. It was clear that there had been some level of confusion when writing the notes. It wasn't long after mid-morning that Colin called one of the church elders, Jim Flanagan, to ask if he had seen Leslie. Colin explained that he and Trevor had had an altercation in the house that night and Trevor had stormed out, and later it seemed Leslie had stormed out and hadn't returned home. Jim first called Hazel sometime around 9 a.m. to ask if Trevor was there. He wasn't, and he actually hadn't been home since the early hours of the morning. Colin asked Jim if he could drive up to Leslie's dad's house to check there. He told Jim that Leslie had been struggling with her dad's death, and it was possible she'd gone up there to feel close to him and to continue to grieve. He gave Jim instructions on how to get there. He would have gone himself, but he had to look after the children now his wife wasn't home. Jim drove up to Castle Rock and checked the outside of Leslie's father's house. He also checked around the back where he found a locked garage, but there was nothing out of the ordinary and no sign of Leslie. When Jim returned to tell Colin he had no luck, Colin asked if he could call the ferry admissions. Quote, "Maybe she and Trevor have boarded a boat for Scotland." He told Jim he'd already called round to the police and hospitals and there was no sign of her there. He then pulled out the crumpled, handwritten letter that he'd found earlier that morning. He showed it to Jim, noting that was one of the reasons he was so worried. Meanwhile, Hazel was worrying back at her house after she'd had no sign of Trevor since the previous night. She and Trevor had spent the day in Lisburn, just over an hour south of Coleraine, with their children. They'd planned for a relaxing day shopping, but the whole afternoon had just been underscored by an unsettling tension. The pair argued for most of the time they were out, and when they got home, Trevor left the family home and headed over to see some of their neighbours, Liz and Bertie. Trevor asked Bertie if he could help to fix one of his son's bikes. Bertie said he didn't have the tools he needed at home, but he could do it on Monday, and then Liz invited him inside. Liz had previously said, quote, "I noticed the vacant look when he came to the door, and I said to Bertie that they must have had a row because I knew what was going on in the background. Trevor had lovely dark brown eyes, but they were glassy and he was shaking. You knew he was irritated and agitated about something." End quote. After Trevor arrived back home and the children were in bed, he and Hazel sat down for dinner a little after 9 p.m, but the tension of the earlier trip into Lisburn was still heavy, and the couple didn't speak very much at all, other than an occasional dig or frustration toward one another. By 10:15 p.m, Hazel said she'd had enough and headed up to bed. She wasn't surprised that Trevor didn't join her and instead stayed downstairs watching television. Hazel said that a few hours later, around 3 or 4 a.m, she woke up to the sound of voices. One was definitely Trevor, and the other she quickly honed in on as being Leslie's. There was nothing she'd rather not do than have to talk to Leslie, so she stayed in bed, and it wasn't long before she fell back to sleep. She wasn't asleep for long though. She woke up at around 5 a.m. and realised that Trevor wasn't beside her in bed. She looked through each room in their bungalow, but he was nowhere to be found. That's when she looked outside the front window and saw their car parked outside the front of the house. This was odd in itself, as Trevor almost always parked the car in the garage. But more so than that, where would Trevor be if he hadn't taken the car? The late morning turned into the early afternoon and there was still no sign of Leslie. Back at Colin's house, he asked Jim again if he could go up to Leslie's dad's house and check. She may have returned there by now and he knew that was the place she'd most likely be. Jim had his friend and police officer David Green join him this time, and the pair headed up to the house for a second time. They knocked on the front door and waited, but there was no answer. They knocked once more, but again, there was no answer. They made their way round the house, knocking on the windows, and then they came across the back door, which was open. After a search inside, they concluded the same as Jim had this morning. There was no one there. As the two men were leaving, they decided to also check the garage. Jim opened up the garage door this time and immediately saw a car. He could see clearly that the driver's side door was open, and to his horror, Trevor Buchanan was lying there, one leg bent at the knee, sticking out of the car, and his lifeless body was slumped forward on the dashboard. Jim rushed over to him to see if he was alive, but as he did so, he smelt gas. He checked the car, and although the ignition was switched to the on position, it wasn't running anymore. The closer Jim got to Trevor, the more apparent the reality became. He was dead. And then his eyes settled on a figure laid down in the back of the car. It was Leslie. She was surrounded by family photos, and her Walkman was playing music into her headphones, which was still placed on her ears. She was also dead. It wasn't long before the pastor called round at Colin's house to tell him the tragic news. When the pastor arrived, he noticed 3 of the children were running around playfully, completely unaware that their worlds were about to change forever. Colin was in clear disbelief. The pastor noted how shocked he seemed, but he gathered the children round pretty much straight away and told them that their mummy had died and she was in heaven now. Devastatingly, one of the children, too young to really understand, asked when she would be coming back, but Colin told them, never. Colin told the police about the phone call he'd gotten that previous evening from Gillian, the wife of the garage owner. and about how concerned she'd been about Leslie. It confirmed what he'd thought about Leslie's suicidal frame of mind. Meanwhile, across town, the pastor's wife, Liz, had arrived to inform Hazel of the news of her husband's death. Hazel bent over and placed her head in her hands. Liz knew the significance of suicide, especially in the church. She had the thought that there was no way Hazel wouldn't be blaming herself, at least partially, for driving her husband to suicide. Both Leslie and Trevor's funerals were planned for the following weeks. Trevor's dad was never the same after his death, and on the morning of his funeral, he walked up to the open casket, pulled Trevor to a seated position, and wept, quote, "Why did you do it, son? Why didn't you come to me?" Trevor had given no indication that he had any previous thoughts of suicide. The sudden change in his mind to take his own life was more than his family could bear. And even with Leslie's troubles over the previous few weeks and months, her family struggled to understand her decisions. Even on the day of her suicide, she had booked in another sunbed session for a couple of days later. It was difficult for anyone to come to terms with her thinking. Both Trevor and Leslie's families were devastated that as a result of an affair, the once positive, bright, caring mother Leslie and the young, promising, devoted husband Trevor had taken their own lives. The next months came and passed, with the children from each family growing up, getting used to life without their mum, Leslie, or their dad, Trevor. Hazel was sitting with her sisters one afternoon watching her two children play. They were sat in the house she had previously shared with Trevor, and Hazel said, quote, "Wouldn't it be lovely if Trevor walked through the door now, to see the joy in Lisa and Andrew's faces?" She kept photos of Trevor around the house to help the children feel his presence and remember his smile. And she took them to Trevor's graveside every single Sunday so that they could lay him fresh flowers and have a moment together with their dad. The inquest for Leslie and Trevor's deaths went ahead around a year after, in May of 1992. The deaths had been determined as poisoning from carbon monoxide for both Leslie and Trevor. Generally, Trevor's state was determined as normal. The only minor abnormalities were that he had an abrasion on his right knee, 2 abrasions on his left knee, and a cut on his lip. There was no alcohol in his system, and there was a small amount of temazepam in his system. Leslie's body showed no outward abnormalities. Her blood samples showed 170 milligrams of alcohol per 100 mils, and a mixture of diazepam, nordiazepam, and temazepam. The pathologist concluded, quote, that it is unlikely that the alcohol and drugs accelerated death to any material extent. Colin was asked to give his testimony, which is when he admitted that there had been a great deal of stress in his and Leslie's marriage after their daughter Lauren was born. He told the inquest that Leslie was struggling with being pregnant again so soon, knowing that they were in a pretty dire financial situation. She had found out she was pregnant in the run-up to Christmas and couldn't cope, thinking the children would have another difficult holiday period ahead of them. On top of that, Leslie's own mum had died just over 2 months before Lauren was born, and he said that she suffered postnatal depression after the birth. Colin went on to talk about the gradual breakdown of the marriage after his affair with Hazel was discovered, and then said that in October of 1990, just a few months before her death, Leslie took an overdose. He said after that, Leslie was often angry and violent towards him, and it wasn't uncommon for her to talk about her previous attempt of dying by suicide. Colin then went on to speak about Leslie and Trevor's relationship after the discovery of his and Hazel's affair. Quote, "She seemed to be in regular contact with Trevor, and on occasion I know Trevor rang our home," end quote. He went on to say that both Leslie and Trevor thought the affair between Hazel and Colin was likely to start back up again. And that's when Leslie's dad died. Her response was, quote, of disproportionate magnitude, and that her attitude to the stability of the marriage changed for the worse after the bereavement, and that Leslie suggested separating and that she'd only be happy if she and Trevor cleared off to leave him and Hazel with the children. In court, Colin also spoke about the handwritten letter he found from Leslie, quote, I read the note several times to understand that there was an implication of suicide stated. My immediate thoughts were to the missing temazepam tablets, and my first action was to contact the police to inquire if she'd been in an accident, being aware the amount of alcohol and tablets she had taken the previous night, end quote. The inquest then moved on to Hazel, who spoke of how difficult Trevor had found the affair to deal with. She said that he wasn't able to come to terms with it and couldn't forgive her or Colin for the lies and deceit. She added that Trevor was particularly sensitive to any of their friends or his colleagues finding out about Hazel's affair. She said that a few weeks before the, quote, end, Trevor met with Leslie to discuss the problem. Hazel then went on to describe the day she and Trevor had had just before his death, and the last time she heard his voice being in the early hours of the morning with Leslie before he left and never returned. The inquest concluded with one of the inspectors stating, quote, trimmed for clarity, it's believed the deaths were brought on as a result of an affair by the spouses of the victims, initially over the period March to October 1990, and indeed afterwards, even up until the time of the incident. Neither of the suicide victims, despite reconciliation attempts, could come to terms with their spouse's infidelity. Leslie Howell had made previous suicide attempts. This was most likely the motivating factor in both of them taking their lives, end quote. The report found both Leslie and Trevor were emotionally upset by difficulties in their marriage, and Leslie by the recent death of her father. Leslie was found dead in the back of her car at 6 Cliff Terrace, Castle Rock, which had a hose pipe from the exhaust into the car, and Trevor was found in the front seat. That report would be the official record of the events of that fateful day, all the way up until almost 20 years later, when the horrific and unimaginable truth would come to light. The joint suicide pact between a broken-hearted husband and a depressed, devastated wife would be revealed to be an unbelievable series of events that started with an affair and ended with a double murder.